Welcome into the Real Family Business Podcast, where our family business is just here to try to help your family business grow. Today, what we're going to talk about is filling the void that is communication in your family business. Keith, I know you got a lot to say on this.
Man, there's so much to be said about this, Jackson, and I'm telling you, there's layers to how you look at this. Communication is one of those things that whether you're a client to consumer or a client to business, business to client, client to client, business to business,
Husband to wife,
wife
to husband,
child to adult, adult to child. I mean, there's layers.
Yep.
And what I've found so too many times is there's a void. People have one thing in mind, and I think there's a framework that I heard years ago at a conference that talked about there's what you want to communicate, how you encode it, how you transmit it, and then how it's decoded. And I think that process, encoding, transmission, decoding, that is where it gets so complicated, so quick, where the unintended consequences can be substantial if you're not mindful of it going in.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but there are a lot of layers to communication. I think as it relates to where we should start is communication is built on every relationship is built on communication in your life, and the better you are at that communication, the better off that your relationships will ultimately be. And I think when you're thinking about it from an employer to an employee, especially in a small business, that is so challenging because you see the problem sometimes. Hey, we got this problem that's going on over here, but you don't necessarily know how to fix it in the moment, right? When you're trying to relay the messages on.
But what was the predicate of what you just said? There's a relationship dynamic in communications. How much relationship will reflect in the nature of what's communicated, how it's communicated, and to some degree, the level of care from the encoding and transmission perspective. I care what you decode out of what I transmit, or I don't care. To what degree do I care? If you're talking to your wife, you better really care about making sure she decodes what you encode.
Yeah.
If you're talking to a client, if you're talking to a colleague, not that you don't care, but the relationship and the dynamics, the context in which that is transmitting is different.
Yeah. Cody, you're obviously relatively new to small business, right? You've been in let's call it big business, the military for a long time. What have you noticed about the uniqueness of a small family business as it relates to communication? Whenever those standards aren't necessarily set from, the origins of whoever built them in the military, it's a little bit of figuring it out, and I think that can be the tough part.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I have seen is the freedom of the complexity of trying to figure it out, right? It's there are no set rules. You're trying to just navigate your path without a compass.
Yeah.
Trying to use other best practices, things you've seen in your own experiences, people you come across, just trying to build that out of how you communicate well. Because, like you both have said, there's no relationship that wins without good communication.
Yeah. So as we think about this title, filling the void, which is really miscommunication, I think we see it a lot of times in smaller businesses. There's just not enough time in the day to get to everything. And I think, like a lot of things, you have to spend extra time at the beginning to get this process started. But I can tell you one of the things that's worked for us, and we've implemented this pretty recently, right? And I think we've been pretty good about communication, but we always have room to improve on these things, is we've moved to weekly meetings as a leadership team. And I think what that's helped us do is communicate about which things are the most important things on the radar. One of those layers of communication, Keith, that you were talking about earlier is you have all these things going on, and I might tell Cody one thing, and it's true, and then 3 hours later, it's not necessarily the most important thing, and it's maybe not as true as it was then because there's new information coming in all the time, right? We're always constantly working, so it's helped us to say, here's our number one priority for the week. Let's go out and do that first, this second, and then we'll come back next week and we'll reset these priorities based on what's going on.
Well, see, I think that's a challenge in small business, is the fact that it's the context in which you're communicating. And you look at small business in the modern information age. What do we know? What does a small business do really well? They care. And so they're trying to convey the fact that they care in the form of how they're communicating, what they're communicating, the timing, and yet everything in society is now moving so fast. You think about living in it's making a distinction between information and knowledge. There's a glut of information. You can go watch a YouTube on how to build a motor, but does that mean that you have the knowledge and experience?
Yep.
And I think some of that same essence of that can be applied to what a business, what a small business, what a family business is trying to communicate, in the vacuum in which they're trying to communicate that.
Yep.
I think that's where a lot of this conversation gets really interesting really quick.
Yeah, that's something really good. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things I have seen, especially here, is the value of having someone who knows sitting alongside someone who doesn't and helping communicate that message across. Because like in the insurance world, there's so much information out there. You can Google, you can use AI, you can use all kinds of things and see tons of information, but trying to sift through it and really understand what it means to have a person there that can communicate experience and wisdom just is so valuable.
Yeah. I think when you think about it for a business, though, I think it really comes into two different areas. There's the first area, which I think is the most important, which is internal communication with your team. And then there's the second area, which the first one's going to impact, which is communication with your client, right? At the end of the day, everyone has some level of client, whether it's B2B or B2C, like they're going to communicate with someone. When we think about that first area, that area of internal communication, what is it that's so often left out in that area that we think, we could maybe talk about for a minute?
There we go. All right. So everywhere I've ever been in my young life, it's siloed communication. You have, say, an IT department, you have an HR department, or a person that does IT, you have a person that does HR, and they are getting communication well from, say, the president or the CEO, but they may not be talking across lanes. And they might be working on the same project.
Yeah.
And they need each other's assistance in that project. But if they're not talking to each other, that void exists. And so that project isn't reaching the level it could possibly be.
So that to me though that's a scalable problem, because I think here's what happens a lot of times in smaller businesses. You start out and guess what? I am the IT guy.
Yep.
I am the HR person. I am the accountant. It's very easy to communicate and collaborate across departments whenever I'm all three things. Whenever I bring someone on and I give it to them, there's this desire to drop it on their desk, and now I'm out of it, right? Because I was overworked by the time I got someone to help me out. Now the communication doesn't happen because it's not, interpersonal communications with yourself. It's you have to talk to someone else, and you have to set the standards for what those communications need to be like to create those lanes. And I think that's a struggle.
Well, notice what he communicated there in his young life, in his youthful life. He keeps his hair short so you can't see the gray.
Yeah.
I know a thing or two about that. No, all kidding aside, I think you're exactly right, and I think that in the small business environment, it's particularly tricky because everybody has the expectation that they want to win. So whatever the topic is that you're dealing with internally, there's this expectation that we've got deadlines, we've got budgets, we've got a lot of constraints that are there's contextual constraints on the communication. And I think a lot of times in small business, it's easy to not manage expectations correctly, or I'm talking about this angle on this issue, and they're coming at that same issue from a different angle, and that's where the miscommunications, that's where the assumptions, everybody knows what to assume stands for. It really, I think that's where that's where the void gets created.
I think you have to. I think if I was breaking it down though, like what would I do if I walked into a business and there was this problem? I think I would do 3 steps. Step number 1 is going to be, I think you have to gain a little bit of trust back. I think with the people, you have to sometimes sit down as a leader and say, "Hey, it's my fault. I apologize for that. I now know it's a problem." That's the first step. Second step is, here's what I would like to do to fix it. I would like to just kind of have a one time, have this discussion with this group, figure out what the biggest problems are. And then the third thing is, and this is the thing that I think is most important, you have to set clear and consistent time frames where you're going to continue that communication, because we all get busy every single day. It's not like we don't want to talk to each other. It's like we don't have time sometimes, and you have to set that time on the beginning so you have time on the back end to take care of it.
And what harmonizes with the point that you just made is the fact that in small business, the advantage that you have is if you're with a team of people that you trust, that you care about, knowing where people's intentions are in what you're doing as you communicate. I think that's one of the biggest things that in our family business, in our small business, that has done more good than anything I can even put into words, is that everybody's heart is golden, everybody's intentions are pure, and that when you have that, and I'm just going to tell you, I don't know about in the Army, I've been in large organizations where that's anything but the case. And I think that is a structural limitation of a large organization that's one of the agility based advantages that
Yep.
small business has is you know that the people that you're working with are on the same wavelengths, or you should. If you don't know that, or if we've brought people into this. I've seen people come into other small business environments. Let me just put it that way, where that's one of the things that drove dissatisfaction. It created retention issues. It created efficacy and profitability issues. There wasn't clarity around the purpose and the consistency, and the communication suffered as a result of the lack of alignment on the front end.
Yeah, it's really three things. You got to care about the people you're working with.
Bingo.
You got to then set clear expectations, and you got to be consistent with those.
That's it.
And I think that in and of itself will handle any internal things that you have going on. Because again, hopefully you have a vision for your company already, right? We've already talked about that on past episodes. So now we know where we're going. Let's communicate it to everyone. Let's set those clear expectations. And I think this is sometimes where communication can go off the track.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I struggle with this. I run really fast sometimes, and I don't sit down and say, hey, I know we talked about what your job is, but do you have questions about it? Because sometimes they're not going to give you that answer very quickly. You have to ask them multiple times, do you know what your job is? You know what? I really don't know. I know I'm in charge of social media, but I don't know what that means. I don't know when you want me to post or what you want me to post or what you want everything to look like. Spend some time clarifying those things and then just be consistent with it, because I think consistency is the thing the majority of businesses lack. Mm-hmm. And so if you have, they also like care sometimes. If you have care and you take care of your people and then you're consistent.
That's the predicate.
You can do crazy things with a business.
That's the ticket right there.
Yeah, I think that's our three watchwords, right? Is care, clear, consistent.
Yep.
If you do those three things with communication, I think it goes back to what you said, Keith, is there are a ton of superstars in your organization, right? No matter how small or big you might be. And those superstars, if they're not communicated to, they feel like they don't have purpose. If they're not part of that discussion, at least to know what's going on, to know what expectations are, they feel like they don't have a purpose maybe. And so that's where that retention comes into play for even those who are excelling at their position.
So what happens when there's a void in one of those? I mean, what is it? You're playing with fire, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you're just when there's a void, somebody's going to fill it with something or someone, and being aligned correctly on the front end. I think is how you avoid that completely.
Absolutely. And I think, what does everybody want from everybody who's on their internal team? You want them to care more. You want them to work harder. You want them to be bought in. Well, how are they going to be bought into something they don't even know about, right? Like give them an opportunity and allow them to surprise you with the results. I think that's a great way of looking at it.
So how do you expect people to communicate with you as a leader in an organization? I mean, there's bottom-up expectations, but what are the top-down expectations? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think this can be tough too, because again, if you run fast and you don't spend enough time consistently with your people, you might have a great relationship with them, and 6 months might go by, and it might, in your mind, be like, oh, it's the exact same, right? What's different? I've just been busy for 6 months. But in their mind, it might have completely changed because you weren't showing them the same time and effort and energy. So again, I'm going to put it back on me a lot of times as a leader. Like, I got to figure out a way to consistently build relationships with everyone. It's kind of like a treadmill. If you're not going forward, you're going backwards. But then once I do that, I would expect my team, once I've invested the time in them for them to know I care, I would expect them to be transparent with me. We have a lot of values around here. One of our core values, one of our rules is, centered around the thought of like, the answer is never, because we've always done it that way. But at the same time, whenever I'm the one who instituted the rule, until someone challenges you on that, your mind probably isn't thinking, hey, we need to change this thing because it's outdated. So you have to have fresh perspectives. You have to have other people, and they have to be willing to be transparent enough with you. And then as a leader, you have to be able to take that and then work through how we fix that together.
So you're saying that there's, as much as anything, there's a culture of communication that you have to create in a small business environment, and you have to be really deliberate with what are the foundational aspects of what it is. That goes back to what some of the points you were making.
I think it starts with if you look at it from like a spouse relationship, I think that's the smallest, like tightest knit communication you're ever going to have in your life. Hopefully it's probably you and your spouse. When you look at that, it takes time. You cannot rush those things. I know that, when my wife used to say things, I didn't necessarily understand what she meant 5-6 years into marriage. Now when she says things, I'm like, okay, that maybe I don't care is actually a no, don't do that, right? So you learn those things over time about each other and the way you communicate. I think you have to give yourself time in the business, but you have to work on it too.
But that raises a good question. So there's things that obviously a lot of the communication can hopefully be made black and white. Who's supposed to say what, when, how's this supposed to flow? But how do you manage the gray with communication?
So, I mean, kind of along the lines of, I'll give you a chance to think there.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've had, or I had experience with in the military, was poor communication. There's just so many people in one organization trying to do their funnel of things or their silo of things. Communication was terrible. So one thing we implemented just as a practice was every morning at 9 o'clock, we had 30 minutes. Went around the room, you had 1 minute to tell me anything you thought was important. It opened the door for that young man who just became a soldier to talk to the boss about what's important to him. It was a two-way communication. And you go back to what you asked about how we communicate to him. It gave that private or that sergeant an opportunity to talk to some major or colonel.
But what you're talking about is managing the gray.
That's what I was about
Managing
to
the
say. I think you have to manage it. I think you have to set responsibilities and be clear with them on who's in charge of which communication. And then I think when there is that gray and you didn't realize it, take responsibility as a leader and fix it. I mean, as simple as that. People just really like to know what's going on. I think our team has been proof of that over the last couple of years.
Great point.
They don't even they love to be involved in things that aren't related to them. I think I said it today on one of our calls, but I love the fact that we do quarterly projects as a team, because I think sometimes it's fun to get outside of the monotonous day-to-day, work with somebody, collaborate with somebody, communicate with somebody that you don't normally work with to produce something that you wouldn't have necessarily built in the normal day-to-day part of your job. It's fun.
Well, you know, and that's one of the things I do think. I took a shot at the structural limitations of big corporate or big organizations. I think one of the things that you see big corporations do to try to remedy this problem is you have they call it reverse mentoring. It's like, you know, communication usually flows top down. But there's times where it's a worthwhile exercise, and I think small businesses could benefit from that too. Is when do you go out and proactively seek reverse flow communications for the purpose of exposing things that you didn't think of, or you didn't prioritize correctly, or things that are maybe in the gray.
Whenever I think about filling this void which is a lack of communication, I think a lot of times businesses' biggest struggle, and I know it's been ours at times, is if you don't intentionally care about how the communication is going on internally. It's kind of like culture. If you don't set the culture is going to be built and you're going to have nothing to do with it, and it's not going to look anything like you, and you're not going to be proud of it, but you are ultimately responsible for it. Communication is the exact same way within an organization, but it takes time to build, and you have to be patient with it. I think the care is a lot of times what's missing in businesses, and it's not missing because they don't care. It's missing because they don't focus on it.
It's time.
It is time. You have to focus on it to make it better. And when we move over to the second area, which is clients, how you communicate with your clients, the biggest issue there, I think, is processes. Because you have to have consistent touch points to touch those clients. I'm not saying that you automate it all. Like, I'm probably the most against communicating with clients via AI. I'll give you an example. I went to Cracker Barrel the other day, right by my house, and I called in to do a to-go order. And it was definitely an AI bot. Definitely an AI. And I was like, are you AI? Oh, I'm not AI. You know, can I have your order? Whatever. So I give it my order. And then in the middle of my order, it's like, oh, wait, I can't take your order because I wanted to change something on. I wanted, like, you know, double bacon on something or something. And it was like, I can't do that. So send me to the restaurant then finally. The girl answers. And she says, okay, so you want this meal? And I was like, yeah, but I already gave you another meal. Like, did you not get that? No, all we have is the current meal. So I'd already ordered one, and that one was gone, disappeared completely. Like, that is what happens when you allow robots to do human jobs. And the communication piece is a human job. It is something that me and you are building a relationship over as a business to a client, and you cannot get rid of that with automation. So the process is important, but the process just tells you when to call, what you say, your soft skills, those kind of things. That has got to be trained.
And this is an interesting dynamic in the modern professional landscape. I think everybody sees that AI and what it can do. There are things that computers can do to augment communication in a constructive way, but it can't be all one or all the other, right? The old way was all human.
Yep.
I think there's ways to leverage technology in a constructive way. And I think some of the most forward-thinking, most rapidly advancing small businesses are figuring out how do we strike that middle ground? How do we keep it off both guardrails, keep it straight in the middle? What do humans do best? What do computers do best? And then how do you discern and fuse those two together?
Who wants to live in a world where it's like AI takes everyone's job, right? Like that's when people talk about that, it just cracks me up. I'm like, who wants to live like that?
Not me.
Like, literally, when you think about it, at the end of the day, it's like, This is our lives. We should be the ones who decide whether or not we want to use it in that way. But I think the AI and the things that it can do, what it does is it actually creates it reduces that gap between large businesses, tons of funds without it. Because I mean, like technically, you could technically get on AI and train yourself on something you should have a degree in if you actually do the deep research and read it and study it, because it's the same process.
But this is an interesting thing for small business. Again, you talk about the changes in society. You and I were just in the classroom this week, right? Guest lecturing,
Yep.
and you we'll talk about that question you asked.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I ask constantly because everybody says all these young people love to use AI. And so I always ask them every time we go in, like once a semester and talk to students. And I just ask them, hey, how many of you use AI versus like a search engine? And it's been increasing over the last couple semesters. But this semester, it surprised both of us. It was over probably 75% of the students said, yeah, we use like a Chat GPT over a Google for something. And I think when you read stats, it's like 75%, yeah, whatever. But when you see it actually, you're like,
You see human beings.
That
I
is
mean, those are
unique.
your clients. I mean, those are future clients. Those are prospective clients telling you they
Absolutely.
communicate differently than my generations, your generation, even though you're so youthful.
yeah, very, very good there. No gray in your beard.
Young 20s.
So, Cody, why don't you wrap us up with your overall thoughts? I know you're a guy of few words, but when you speak, many listen. So, what is your thoughts on communication?
I think it all goes back to managing expectations, and even God used words to manage expectations.
Yep.
So when it comes down to family business, if you're not communicating, you're failing. Because one of the biggest things we talk about too is getting a message out. But as Keith brought up earlier, it's making sure that message is received properly. So get a message out on a consistent and clear basis to the people you care about in your organization and those clients, but also make sure that they've received the message you've tried to send.
Yep, absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, it's your business. You got to take control of it. And the way you control anything in business is you have to set the correct standards. You have to care about the people you're working with, and you need to build a culture of communication. No one's ever really been hurt too much for over communication. I think people maybe don't like the meetings where they don't get anything out of it. But the reality is more businesses suffer from a lack of communication than anything. And so don't let your business fall into the trap of having a void of communication.